Hello, and thank you all so much for joining me for this presentation. This presentation is very near and dear to my heart, and I'll get a little bit into that in just a moment. My name is Tiffany Works. I am a licensed independent clinical social worker, and I did serve as a volunteer firefighter for 8 years, and I currently serve as a reserve deputy with the local county. I permanently serve as what they call a chaplain, but I do critical incident stress management with first responders and other individuals in the community. I've responded to schools, I've responded to incidents, I've responded to scenes, done death calls, a variety of different roles in the critical incident and stress management role with the sheriff's office. I've been doing that since 2013. I went through a class in February 2020 to become critical incident and stress management certified. So our objectives for this presentation is we're going to identify who the first responders are. I think we pretty much all have an idea of who the first responders are, but just in case, I want to review those because there may be some that we don't think about. We also want to be able to define a first responder crisis, understand what is different about a first responder crisis, learn the signs and symptoms of a first responder in crisis, identify statistics and facts associated with first responder crises, and acquire a basic understanding of critical incident and stress management. And we also want to be able to identify mental health resources available to first responders, which we'll learn a good bit about that as we go along. Who are first responders? According to the Webster's Dictionary, a first responder is a person who is among those responsible for going immediately to a scene of an accident or an emergency to provide assistance. So immediate, accident, and emergency, those are three keywords there that I want you to think about. So law enforcement officers consist of police officers, deputies, state troopers. They're usually the first on the scene because they're always out on patrol, or most of them are on patrol. And oftentimes when there is a dispatch call, police officers must respond to the scene to secure that scene and make sure it's safe for firefighters, paramedics, or other first responders to come into that scene or to arrive onto that scene. When we're talking about firefighters, this includes volunteer firefighters. Paramedics and emergency medical technicians, they're the secondary care that arrives on the scene and provides treatment and transportation on the scene. They'll usually stabilize victims on the scene and transport them to the next level of care that is necessary. And then, of course, we don't need to forget about our dispatchers. We'll talk a little bit about each one of these a little bit further in the presentation. But as far as dispatchers, they're not actually responding to the scene, but they're always the initial responder. They're the first ones to answer the phone call. They're the ones that are dealing with distraught victims, distraught callers. Oftentimes, they're the lifeline until someone arrives on the scene. So there is trauma involved with the dispatchers as well. And oftentimes, these are first responders that many people don't think of when it comes to first responders. Also, something to keep in mind is that many of these professionals, these first responders, are cross-trained. Many law enforcement officers are also firefighters, and vice versa. Firefighters are law enforcement officers. Many paramedics are paramedics and EMTs are firefighters. Many dispatchers have worked in correctional facilities. They've worked as law enforcement officers or deputies. And I know that sounds kind of funny, me talking about law enforcement officers or deputies, but there is a difference. Law enforcement officers are usually peace officer certified standard officers that work for a municipality. A deputy works for the sheriff's office, and they carry out the orders of a court, but they also respond in law enforcement capacity. State troopers, obviously, they are employed by the state versus a county or a city. So just wanted to make a little bit of of a definition there and why I use those words differently instead of interchangeably. Law enforcement, we can say law enforcement officer or LEO for short. But when these individuals are cross-trained, one thing that we need to keep in mind is that they are, because they're trained in both, they're oftentimes leaving one job and going to the next job. So if they've worked a 24-hour shift as a firefighter, then wake up in the morning and have to report in at 6 a.m. or 7 a.m. to be a law enforcement officer and work a 12-hour shift. So on Monday, 24 hours, they were responding to incidents. And then for the next 12 hours as a law enforcement officer, they're responding to incidents. So it's this repetitive and cumulative exposure to incidents. So what is a crisis? So the ICISF, the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation Incorporated, defines a crisis as an acute emotional reaction to a powerful stimulus or demand. And I say acute because we as social workers know what the difference in acute and chronic is. Acute meaning like immediate, short-lived, right now. Chronic meaning ongoing, pretty much there forever, right? So just something to keep in mind. So repetitive exposure to acute can lead to some other things when we start talking about diagnoses. So the definition for a crisis is the same for everyone. So it's this acute emotional reaction to a powerful stimulus or a demand. So it's the same for everyone, but there are things that make it different for first responders. So some characteristics of someone being in a crisis include the usual balance between thinking and emotions are disturbed. So the way they think doesn't match the way they feel. So sometimes a coping mechanism for first responders may be laughing or talking like all is fine, all is okay. I've seen it many times when responding to a scene, when police officers are responding to a motor vehicle accident and, they're sitting there having this normal conversation. If any of you work in healthcare, you know that healthcare workers, they sit and talk about the grossest, most horrible things at lunch over their food because it's their tolerance level. They see it every day, they're exposed to it every day. So, it's not necessarily a gross topic to them. So these first responders it's kind of the same thing there. They're able to be there on the scene and not being in a disrespectful way. Maybe they're standing away from the scene. They're not very involved with the scene or hands-on at the scene at the time. But, they're kind of over in the corner having this conversation, but really inside they're dealing with some of these emotions, and the way that they're acting right now is definitely not matching the way that they're thinking, the way that they're feeling. So that balance is very much disturbed. The usual coping mechanisms fail. So what they used to do doesn't work anymore, and we'll discuss some of the things that first responders use as coping skills. We're not really going to go into depth too much about the coping skills, but we'll talk about some of the coping skills that happens as a result of the trauma and how those coping skills aren't healthy and how they might lead to problems. There is evidence of distress, impairment, or dysfunction in the individual or group. So many times it's several of us first responders that are responding, and we feed off the energy of each other and what's going on. So if someone else is responding one way, that may be a little bit contagious to the way that we respond as well, and so that causes a dysfunction in the group. Or if one of us responds differently to an incident, and the other person isn't responding that way, where our feelings and our responses are not matching up, and so it may cause some discord. So there's dysfunction, impairment there, distress, dysfunction, and impairment, all three keywords that they're going to experience. So it's either going to impair them individually as a person or as a group. So this can mean that it makes them unable to perform their duties effectively. Also creating more frustration because when they know that they're off, they're having a bad day, they're off, they're not responding, they're not as prompt, they're not as effective, they're not as efficient as they normally are, they're not as observant, whatever the skills that they normally have aren't there as usual because this dysfunction and impairment and distress has led to that. And so they know this interferes with their job performance. First responders, we know when we're off, we know when we're not functioning on all cylinders, if you will, which also leads to more self-criticism. Gosh, if I could just get through this or if I could get over this, I might be able to have done something differently or better. So defining a critical incident. And so as you see here, we have a list of things that are always a critical incident, and we have a list of things that are maybe a critical incident. And several things come into play when we look at these. And as critical incident stress management responders or mental health professionals or social workers, whatever our role may be in dealing with a critical incident, we need to know when is always and when it may be a critical incident. And one thing that I just want to note here is that a critical incident is what causes a crisis. So the critical incident can be a number of things. It could be a fatality from a motor vehicle accident. It could be a gunshot wound that has led to a death. It could be a self-inflicted death. It could be a violent death, accidents, just a whole, there's a bunch of different incidents that can cause this type of crisis and stress that these first responders are responding to. So when defining if it's a crisis, from a critical incident, some things that I want you to keep in mind is always a line of duty, death of service, suicide of a coworker, mass casualty. So when there's a bunch of people that are injured in something, that we're always going to respond as a critical incident. Catastrophic, major illness, work related, majority officer involved shootings. So assault on provider. So an assault on provider meaning someone tries to hurt another a first responder. And it may be, and some things that I want you to keep in mind when trying to determine if these maybes are going to be treated as a critical incident is take into account like major incidents with children. So you want to take a look at the individual, you want to take a look at the group. So if you've got a group of young law enforcement officers or a group of young firefighters that have young children at home or who have never responded to an incident that involves a child and it's their first one, then this is probably a critical incident. And especially with children, I can remember responding to do a debriefing. There was a motor vehicle accident and there was a child fatality, and I responded to the fire department, and there were some young firefighters there, and the young firefighters were looking at the older firefighters. The older firefighters have, accumulation over years, have experienced this type of traumatic incident and have learned to either deal with it or being denial about it. We're going to talk about that as well. But these young people, there's a stigma surrounding it. They don't want to really act like things are bothered, but what they don't know is that when these first responders spend 12 hours together, they become like family, or when they're spending 24 hours together, they start learning to notice differences in their partners. And so these older guys are noticing difference. So I'm here and I'm debriefing and primarily dealing with some of the younger firefighters because they have a child close to that age at home, or because this is their first incident with a child. If there's a large media response, there's a lot of pressure on first responders with media. We are trained to inform them that, we're not allowed to talk or speak on the incident, that there is an incident commander or a public information officer that will be glad to answer that information. But having to deal with large media that is coming at us when we're on a scene and we're trying to do our job is definitely a distraction, and it causes an increase in stress. It causes an increase and stress, which then impacts our jobs. And so the way that we're responding can be traumatic for us. If there's dramatic or intense families involved, this one particular motor vehicle accident that I was talking about that I responded to that involved a child also involved a young boy who it was also fatal for the young man, for the young boy. And his family was there, and it was loud shrieks and shrills. And because of where the accident occurred, it was down low, and there were plenty of places, platforms up above the incident where people could look onlookers there and looking, and it was big crowds, and video cameras were out, and it was just very, very intense. So definitely, even if that wasn't a fatality and there were a large media response or dramatic or intense families on the scene, then definitely you're going to treat that as a critical incident. When something doesn't go right, when you don't have enough people on staffing, or when protocol is broken, or, where there's discipline issues, things like that, that maybe caused them to not be able to perform their duties or their job or their skills effectively or correctly, that led to something worse than what it began as. So, in other words, if someone, if they go somewhere and they need to provide CPR, and they, mess up on that, or protocol is broken and the person doesn't make it because they didn't perform CPR right, then that's definitely a critical incident. Too close to home, meaning, is this someone that we know? Is it familiar to something that happened to us before? And then, of course, cumulative stress or events. So repetition, so things happening over and over and over again, or the same similar incident happening over and over again. So I responded to that accident where the child and young man that were fatally injured. And the very next day, I get a phone call from another fire department wanting me to come in to brief them over a child that had taken some medication by accident. A baby got a hold of some parents' medication and overdosed on accident, but they didn't know that that's what happened. So there were two children, that were fatally injured in the same day, and it was the same crew that responded the very next day. So back-to-back incidents involving a child of the same age, very close to the age of their children. So those are definitely things to keep in mind. So, repetition and, first times on a scene. I remember the first time that I responded to a scene. I'll never forget the first time. In fact, the first time that I ever responded as a firefighter, a volunteer firefighter, there was a fatality involved. And I'll never forget that for as long as I live. So moving on, why is a first responder crisis different? So we determined earlier that a crisis, the definition of a crisis is the same across the board. A crisis for you and me is the same as a crisis. The definition of a crisis is the same for you and me as it is for a first responder. But the things that make a first responder crisis different is that, one, this is inherent to the nature of their jobs. So you've heard the fight, flight, and freeze. Most first responders have that fight, run into the fire, run into the danger. Those who have the flight, they're running away. Not firefighters, not law enforcement officers, not paramedics, not EMTs, not dispatchers. They're going in. They're going in. So it's inherent to the nature of their job. They're trained to do that. They're built for that naturally, and educated, trained, physically, all the things inherent to the nature of their jobs. Exposure to intense situations. So, like, if you're not a first responder, you may be driving down the road and you may be exposed to an intense situation, but that may be the only time you're ever exposed to an intense situation. But first responders are exposed to these intense situations over and over and over and over again. Furthermore, they're in these high stress environments, dramatic families, media, complicated equipment to use. Are they able to put their training to use and really make it work and really make it count? Um, there's high expectations and low pay. You have to also think about the hours that they're working. Most firefighters are working 24-hour shifts. And for most of them, they're leaving that 24-hour shift and going to ride on an ambulance or going to work at a law enforcement agency. So we need to keep that in mind. 24 hours is a long time to be on high alert in a high stress environment and be ready to go and be functioning on all cylinders at your very best for 24 hours. And then, of course, as we've talked about, repetitive exposure and witness to crises. So if we see things over and over and over and over again, what do you think's playing over and over and over and over in a first responder's mind? They may be playing that scene over and over and over again, and parts of another instant are creeping into that. Before they know it, their thoughts may be consumed with these incidents, these traumatic or critical scene incidents that they've been responding to, and the tempo of their work. So in a course of a 24-hour period or over the course of a 12-hour period, I mean, they're moving, they're jumping, they're hopping. I mean, when I used to ride patrol and I used to do some of the other things other than just serve as critical incident stress management and also teach women self-defense classes, but but when you're riding patrol, I mean, in a split second, you're getting a call on your radio, respond to XYZ address, this is going on. And while you're at that scene, you may actually get a call for another one. So it could be back to back to back to back and just a constant going, and then not knowing what you're going to next. Some radios fail sometimes, they break up. You don't get all the information that you need. Or perhaps when dispatch is called, you've got a distraught caller on the phone. So the unpredictable scenes, you just have to be ready for anything. And so hormonal levels and these different responses, adrenaline and things start rising in their bodies. And so when that adrenaline starts coming down, it becomes very, very difficult to overcome that adrenaline. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. But when we get this information from dispatch, there are many factors that could lead to the uncertainty of what we're going to expect. The caller, like I said, could be distraught or giving false information or giving incorrect information. And when we get to the scene, it's something totally different than what we expected. In our minds, we're prepared to do this, but when we get there, we have to be able to immediately change, and we have to fall back on our training, just like with any other profession, and be able to change and go with the flow at any moment. So the next slide here is the effects of crises on first responders. And as you can see, it's color-coded, green to yellow to orange and to red. And as with any color-coded chart, we always associate these colors with green being go, yellow being slow down, orange being we might need to pump the brakes, and red meaning we're going anti-lock brake system. Okay, like we're critical. We're there. We're in the hot zone. We're red. We're hot. Orange is getting, as far as the prisms of colors go, orange is getting closer to the red, so we're getting into the end zone, to the danger zone, to the hot zone, whatever it is that you want to call it. But this is a continuum. So ready is where we want to be. We want to be, we want to have a sense of mission, spiritually, emotionally, physically, healthy, emotionally available, clarity of thoughts and clarity of feelings and emotions. We want to be sleeping good. We want to be thankful. We want to be spunky and ready to go. And we want to be able to go with the flow at any time. We want to be able to change. We want to, be able to respond the way that we need to. So, after a couple of calls over a 24-hour shift or a 12-hour shift, we may be moving into the our bodies are starting to react. Adrenaline is starting to build up in our bodies. And so when your adrenaline is running high, you're not going to sleep as well. It's also going to affect our attitudes. We're going to become more critical. We may avoid things. We may not have as much interest. We may mood changes. We may not do things as effectively or sufficiently as we're supposed to. We may not be able to think as clearly or be like, oh, I've got an idea and this is what I need to do with this. Or, hey, what about this, when we're trying to figure out how to solve this problem on the scene. Injured being orange, this means, that we didn't come out of the yellow and drift back into the green after all of the things settled down. It means that it stuck with us, and now we're really having some sleep issues. We're becoming numb. Oh, I'm fine. Nothing's bothering me. I'm good. Burnout, nightmares. This is when the nightmares may start happening. This is where we start going from that acute stress that I talked about earlier, and we start turning it into chronic stress. And as social workers, if you're familiar with the diagnostic and statistical manual, some of these things that you're going to see in the injured column, in the critical column, are definitely going to align with signs and symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. You might see some acute stress disorder in the reacting and injured part. They may blend a little bit together, but when you start getting over into the orange and the red, that's when you're going to start seeing some signs and symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. So those are things definitely to be looking out for. Red flags, orange flags. What are you looking for? The physical symptoms. Restlessness. We're going to talk some more about some symptoms here in just a little bit. Feeling trapped, just like don't have anywhere to go. But whenever we're talking about critical incident and stress management, and we're providing a debriefing, or we're providing that service to first responders, we want to be able to decide where they are on this continuum. We want to be able to decide what is baseline for them on this continuum. Because when we're providing the services of debriefing and critical incident and stress management, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get them back to a baseline. We're moving from point A to point B. So wherever we are on this continuum, we want to try to get as far back to normal or as far back to baseline as possible. So it's why it's important that when we're thinking about where we are with a first responder, that we think about ready, reacting, injured, and critical. RRIC, red, yellow, orange, red. Pretty standard color coded there for us. So some signs and symptoms of ongoing critical incident stress. So again, ongoing, repetitive, cumulative. Those are some words that you've heard throughout this presentation. Behavioral, restlessness, so pacing, not being able to sit still, tossing and turning in bed, irritability and moodiness. Antisocial behavior, like we've peopled enough. We don't want to people anymore. I want to be left alone. I don't want to have a conversation with anybody. I don't want to have to do any explaining. I don't want to people. I don't want to be around people anymore. And an increase in alcohol consumption. So there is a high rate of alcoholism along first responders. I don't have those statistics in this presentation, but I would encourage you to go look up those statistics just for your own knowledge and for your own benefit. I definitely think that there's a lot more that each of us could look up regarding this topic and become more familiar with. And when we get to the end of the presentation, I'll tell you why it's important for us to go and research this more. Cognitive signs and symptoms, poor concentration, confusion, or uncertainty, and nightmares. Again, if you start looking at these things, you start noticing some of the signs and symptoms that are listed under post-traumatic stress disorder or acute stress disorder. The increased alcohol consumption, I would just like to note that that's self-medication. In addition to alcohol, there may be other substances that they're using to self-medicate with. And so we've developed another problem on top of a problem. Some physical signs and symptoms: vomiting and chills, headaches, disrupted sleep, muscle tremors, and chest pain. Um, the vomiting and chills, headaches, disrupted sleep, muscle tremors, and chest pains, those are all things that can come with an adrenaline dump. So I want you to think about a time when you've been very, very overly excited or overly afraid or overly stimulated. Think about a time when you've experienced that. And then after that's over with, after that excitement's over with, after that fear is over with, and everything is back to normal, you're no longer afraid, you're no longer excited, do you feel exhausted? Do you remember a time when your adrenaline just skyrocketed? This happens often in the women's self-defense classes that I teach, and we forewarn them about an adrenaline dump. It's a real thing. So, when we're teaching these women self-defense classes, these women are physically fighting. They have pads on, but they're physically fighting, but they're very nervous. They're scared. We are putting them in scenarios where they're being attacked and they have to fight their way out of this. And so their adrenaline level goes up, and it's just a natural response that our body has to these situations. And so when that adrenaline rises and rises and rises and rises, and it gets to its highest level, and that's how you hear of people able to single-handedly pick up a car and lift a car up off of a body, or do things that are almost superhero-like. That's adrenaline that they're functioning on. And so when first responders are responding, their adrenaline is going. Now, over time, they do learn to regulate that adrenaline. It may not always get as high as it did on the first time that they responded to a scene. Like I said, I can remember the first scene that I responded to, and I can also remember the first time that I fought in the women's self-defense class as a student, and that adrenaline dump, and I did experience almost every one of those physical signs and symptoms of a critical incident. Emotional depression and anxiety, of course, this is to be expected, and then of course anger. Anger is part of the grief cycle. It's something that we're going to experience when we are grieving. And then guilt, depression, anxiety, intense anger, grief, and guilt. So shoulda, coulda, wouldas. If I would have been better on my game, if I would have done this a little bit better, if I'd had more training. So very, very self-critical, negative self-thinking that also leads to these things. The poor concentration, confusion, uncertainty, and the nightmares, those are definitely all symptoms of stress, period. If you're under stress, I'm under stress, we're going to experience poor concentration, confusion, and uncertainty. I know I do. I know for me, when I am extremely stressed, I can't keep my thoughts straight sometimes. So imagine if you're responding to these very, very, very intense, traumatic incidents. So a lot of times, they're going to blame themselves, and they just become very critical of their skills. And like I said, a lot of shoulda, coulda, wouldas. So some statistics and facts about first responders. First responder deaths make up 1% of all suicides. Now, 1% doesn't seem like a lot, but I want you to go and I want you to research the number of suicides in 2024, if that information is available, or even 2023. Now, this 2015 to 2017 is where that statistic came from. But I want you to go and research, look it up, go look up the number of deaths or the number of suicides in 2023. And then let's say, it was, and I'm going to go with a low number because I'm a social worker, not a mathematician, but let's just say it was 30. And 1% of those, 3 of them, are going to be law or first responders. By discipline, out of that 1%, more than half are law enforcement officers. So either a police officer, a deputy, or a state trooper. And second to that, about a quarter of that 1% is firefighters. And then pretty close to firefighters, emergency medical services. And then 2% of dispatchers. So that's pretty significant. Now, when I talk about the law enforcement officers being at 58%, I just want to ask you a question. Why would you think that law enforcement officers would have 27, no, let's see. Why is there such a big difference in the percentage of law enforcement officers that have committed suicide versus firefighters? There's a couple of theories that I have, and I would like to encourage you to go and look at this. Why are law enforcement officers make up more suicides than firefighters? One theory that I have is that one, earlier, who did I say was the first on the scene most of the time? They're to secure the scene. They're to make sure that the scene is safe for firefighters or EMT to come in. Law enforcement officers. So they're usually the first ones to go in and see and have that initial response. Furthermore, law enforcement officers are riding around, by most of them by themselves in a vehicle all day long. What do you do when you go on long trips, when you drive all day long? Or you're sitting watching traffic or whatever the case may be? You're thinking, aren't you? You're thinking. So on a slow day, lots of thoughts creeping in, lots of things to think about there. So law enforcement officers, they're by themselves. Firefighters, they're sleeping. They're 24 hours together. Now, law enforcement officers that work the 12-hour shifts together, their crew become just as close and as family as a group of firefighters that are going to work 24 hours together. But firefighters, they sleep in the same place together. They eat their meals together. They have more of a family dynamic than a law enforcement officer does. So that's another theory that I have. Compared to other suicides, the use of a firearm was most prevalent. So 69% of first responder suicides were by a firearm versus 44% of non-first responders. That's pretty significant. So, I mean, I don't know, to think about that number, 69%, when I think, if I rounded that up to 70, like, that's extremely significant. The known circumstances, and what I mean by known circumstances, like the reasons for the suicide, reasons that first responders give for suicide, or reasons that we know of that they commit suicide, is intimate partner problems. So, intimate partner problems. What causes intimate partner problems? Well, there are several things that I would like for you to think about. One is substance abuse or alcoholism, how that interferes in a relationship. Also, the moodiness, so mood changes, a short temper, a short fuse, and if they are having nightmares or they are having, startled hypervigilance or startled responses, they may accidentally or maybe even purposely become violent. Also, just not talking, many partners to law enforcement officers want their law enforcement officer or partner to talk to them about what they've done that day or what's happened throughout the day. And most don't. They won't, because they don't feel understood. And, oftentimes they feel like if they talk about it to someone that don't know what they do every day and don't understand, that it's just going to bring it back up again. They don't think it's very helpful. Job problems. So, all the signs and symptoms that they're experiencing from this stress, from this critical incident stress, is contributing to their job performance. They're not as effective, not as efficient, and so they're making more mistakes. They're missing more traffic stops. They're not doing CPR as effectively or sufficiently as they used to. They're if they're a paramedic or whatever they're doing in the back of an ambulance, they're not able to start an IV as quickly or as smoothly as they used to. And I'm just throwing examples out there of things that might happen on a job performance because of the stress. And then physical health problems. I mean, we talked about the physical signs and symptoms of chronic stress, and those sorts of things take a toll on you. I mean, we all know that stress impacts your heart. Your adrenaline causes your heart rate to increase. Your heart is a muscle. The harder it beats, the more it works. The more it works, the quicker it wears out. And then also just the physicality of these jobs of law enforcement officers, of firefighters and EMTs. I mean, think about the things that they have to do. Law enforcement officers are having to run and chase people and wear 30 pounds of equipment on them for 12 hours. Firefighters are having to lift people. They're having to use very heavy equipment, drive large vehicles, which, by the way, are not very easy to drive. I mean, actually, they require special training to be able to drive those vehicles. And so there's the body starts to wear out, and and when the body starts to wear out and they're not able to perform their job like they used to, that's going to have an impact on them. The unreported critical incident stress is a cultural aspect. So most law enforcement officers want to remain that tough exterior, and we call it image armor. So in the critical incident stress management, Dr. Jeffrey T. Mitchell, his critical incident stress management program calls that image armor. So we have this image that we're portraying. We're still chin up, eyes up, shoulders back, standing at attention, ready to go. We're always carrying ourselves like we're under control, right? Got our uniforms on, we're good. We're ready to go. We've got that image armor. Also, the Titanic syndrome. I'm invincible. I'm untouchable. I've been doing this 20 years. It doesn't bother me anymore. There's no way that it does not bother them. Now, do they become numb to them? Yeah. Yeah, feeling numb. We're getting into the orange into the red when we start feeling numb. Like if we pull up on a scene and it stops and we know that it stops bothering us, where it no longer bothers us to see XYZ, we might need to take a step back as a first responder. When I say we, a first responder may need to take a step back if things aren't bothering them anymore. Stigma, especially, I talked earlier about debriefing a fire department, and there were younger guys versus older guys. The older guys went back, to the fire department, went back into their kitchen and carried on preparing their meal. And the young guys were just kind of sitting there in the corner, very quiet, afraid of what the other firefighters were going to say, afraid of what someone was going to say. However, in the next day where I had to go debrief because there was another incident with a child, I'm starting to, when I go and debrief, I'm starting to see more and more seasoned firefighters admit that they've been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. It's sad to hear, but it's also very enlightening to know that they are starting to disclose this information. Why are they starting to disclose it? Why do you think that people are starting to admit that they have post-traumatic stress disorder? Why are they starting to reach out for help? The reason is because we're taking away that stigma. Green is the color for mental health awareness, and that's something very near and dear to my heart, and it's why I talk about this subject. It's why I loved teaching about this subject or educating about this subject, because I feel like the more we educate, The more knowledge we have, the better we can respond to things, and the better we can respond, then the less stigma there is. So it's this cycle. A lack of resources. When I was researching resources for my state or just any state whatsoever, there are states that have specific resources for first responders. So wherever you are, I want you to go do your homework, and I want you to find what resources are available to your first responders. And I want to encourage you, challenge you to go to your law enforcement agencies, to your sheriff's office, to your city, municipality, your police officers, your chief of police. I want you to ask, do their officers know who to call in a crisis in your state? So where I'm at, we don't have a specific number to call for first responders. Okay. PTSD and first responders, I just put this up there because 1 in 4 first responders experience depression. That's 25%. More than 1 million adults suffer from depression in any given year. More officers die from suicide than line of duty deaths. So I don't know how that makes you feel, but whenever I think about, more officers dying by their own hands versus responding to a dangerous scene, that really gives me a lot to think about. It really, really does. It's high, this is for police officers, but it's high for all first responders. And it's significant to know if they have a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, because your debriefing may be a little different for someone or individuals that have post-traumatic stress disorder. In fact, it may be sometimes if they know they have that diagnosis and they've been treated for it, and they're aware of their signs and symptoms, they're probably more self-aware and probably more aware of baseline for themselves than someone who has not been diagnosed. So it's very good to know if there is someone that you're debriefing that has PTSD. And like I said, I'm starting to hear more and more people, or more and more first responders, admitting to being diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So the basic critical incident and stress management. So this is from Dr. Mitchell. Critical incident and stress management. You can pretty much read that. Comprehensive, organized approach for the reaction and control of harmful aspects of stress. And then there it tells you some forms of intervention. Pre-incident education. So when we have a newcomer that comes into the law enforcement agency, we want to let them know, what to expect. On-scene support, like, are you going to call a chaplain? Are you going to call someone who's critical incident and stress management certified out to the scene to be watching and looking for some of these first responders that are experiencing on the scene signs and symptoms? Demobilization, defusing, debriefing, crisis management briefing, family support. Do they have a good family support system? Assessment, follow-up and referral, and mutual aid. Mutual aid, we're going to talk a little bit about that here in just a moment, and what I would refer to as mutual aid. So crisis management is a cycle, like preparing, prevention, identification, recovery, monitoring. Then we go right back into preparing. So it's almost like the grief cycle. Like, we're constantly doing this. We're constantly working to prepare ourselves for the crisis. We're constantly working to prevent it. How do we prevent it? Teaching good coping skills. How do we identify crisis? How do we recover from it? And then once we recover, what are we going to do? How are we monitoring it? Who's monitoring it? And those are all, as a critical incident stress management responder, those are all things that you need to know. Like, how prepared were these people? What kind of things did they do to prevent it? How do they identify that they're in a crisis? And what is their recovery and what is their monitoring system. Sometimes it may be you. Sometimes it may be you that goes back by the fire department and says, hey, I just want to stop by and see how you're doing. So mental health resources for first responders. I put this up here basic because the CISM team, critical incident stress management team, I just kind of made that up because there's a few things that I want to talk about there. But helplines, we have the new 988 number, which is the suicide and mental health crisis care number. So that's a national number. 911, obviously, that's the number that you're going to call in the event of an emergency medical service, fire, and police. Those are the dispatchers that I was talking about. So when you call 911, that's who you're going to get. And the 211 is not necessarily a hotline or a suicide and mental health crisis care with emphasis. It's not really who you're going to call and talk to about your problem, but it's where you can call to find services that are available for a law enforcement officer. So if you don't know what resources are available to law enforcement officers or firefighters, any first responder in your area, 211 would be a good place to start. Or like I said, I encourage you to go and speak to your chief of police or your sheriff or your education coordinator of your sheriff's office. Find someone that you know in first responder world and see what information you can find out. A critical incident and stress management team could consist of a social worker, and I put social worker on there because we're all social workers. We could easily put clinician there, okay? That could be a therapist, just someone that's clinically trained and educated, but I'm partial to social workers. Peer support. Now, I'm going to tell you, I have seen peer support work so good and so wonderful because first responders, my cat's about to come up here and visit us. First responders want to feel heard. They want to feel understood, just like everybody else does. So a lot of times when I walk in and they see me, a female, they're like, really? Really? This woman's going to come in here and she's going to debrief us about a wreck with a child fatality. What does she know about that? She's probably some therapist that's just coming in here and teaching us what she's learned out of a book. But whenever I go in and I introduce myself and I tell them that I had 8 years experience as a volunteer firefighter, and I tell them that I have had 13 to 25, 12 years of experience in law enforcement, their minds change a little bit. Now, the male to female barrier and men are from Mars, women are from Venus thing does kind of play, there is a play there. So, definitely something to consider. Guys tend to talk to and deal with guys better. Their brains just function more alike each other. A chaplain. Now, I'm called a chaplain in the role that I serve in, but I'm really a critical incident stress management certified person, responding in that role. But the sheriff's office that I work for just chooses to title me as a chaplain. Now, I will pray with someone, but the spiritual part of responding to a scene is not my priority. And then an incident commander. So if you are critical incident stress management, you are a chaplain, you are a social worker, and you do work with law enforcement or any first responders, and you're going to a scene, you need to know who your incident commander is. That's the person who is in the middle, or actually who's away from the scene, but knows everything about that scene, everything that's going on. I can tell you that the child fatality and the young man fatality that I responded to, I just use this as an example because it was just a really big deal, and it kind of involved everything that could possibly involve a critical incident could involve. But whenever I think about that, the incident commander and that was in the fire department, he was like, "Hey, just wanted to let you know that there were some police officers that were first on the scene. I don't know who they are, but they didn't seem like they were handling it too well." So that's why it's important to know who your incident commander is. And although he didn't know who they were and he didn't know what baseline was for them, he just could tell, he could see some of that physical stuff going on with them. So he was able to give me some of that information. I was able to contact some of that particular municipality's police officers that I know and say, hey, who were these people that were on the scene? And I was able to follow up with them. Um, I want you, so if you're interested in critical incident and stress management training opportunities, I have listed there at the bottom ICISS, International Critical Incident and Stress Foundation, and /training-education/. So definitely, if you don't take anything else away from it, take that away, go. There's information there. And also, you can Google the slideshow of Dr. Jeffrey T. Mitchell as far as critical incident goes. You can also look for PDFs that give you definitions of crises, critical incident, stress management, debriefing, and things of that nature. You can also look up, steps for debriefing. But there with the bullet points, let's go there for just a minute. Does your area have a team? The city where you work, the community that you're involved in, do y'all have a CISM team? And if you don't, why don't you? Ask your local sheriff's office what you can do to help. The reason I say sheriff's office is because sheriff's office pretty much has their hand in everything. They're involved with the municipalities, they're involved with the fire departments, they're involved with the paramedics. They know everything. They're a very powerful person in every county. But if you know people that are first responders, ask them. Ask them if they are, if they have something, do they debrief after every critical incident? The always list. Do they debrief after something on the always list from that slide? When do they debrief? And if they don't, I want to challenge you or encourage you as a social worker. What can you do? What can you do to help? I know what I did. I went and became critical incident and stress management certified. And not only I worked with the probate judge's office, but not only did becoming critical incident and stress management serve me well in being a chaplain with the sheriff's office where I'm a reserve deputy, it served me well as a social worker. And again, critical debriefing, critical incident stress management is not meant to be therapy. We do need to refer if we do see signs and symptoms that we can't bring back into the green or the yellow or baseline at least. Here is my contact information. Please feel free to write it down. That is Bama Bell with an E, and that is 11, not an L, at yahoo.com. So Bama Bell 11 at yahoo.com. If you have any questions, or if you want to know more about critical incident stress management, or even some ideas, if you want to brainstorm some ideas on maybe how you can start a critical incident and stress management team in your area, where to begin, or whatever I can do to help, please feel free to reach out. If I don't answer your first email, send me another email and type, hey, real big in the subject line, or type, hey, I saw your presentation and I want to talk. Grab my attention some way. But again, my name is Tiffany Works. I am a clinical social worker, critical incident stress management, served in the volunteer fire department for 8 years. I am a reserve deputy with the local sheriff's office here and do critical incident stress management and serve as a chaplain and teach women's self-defense classes. So I love what I do. I love educating on this subject, as hard and as difficult as it may be. But again, I've had the opportunity to encourage and challenge each one of you to go and find out what's available for your first responders in your area. So again, please don't hesitate to reach out if I can help with anything. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for joining. Agents of Change has been a wonderful part of my life, helped me pass my exam. I appreciate Megan and all of the Agents of Change individuals and everybody that presents. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
I hope you enjoyed this continuing education course from Agents of Change. Want to earn your CE credits for this course? Visit agentsofchangetraining.com or the link in the description to purchase the course and take the post-test. If you're looking for more CEs, check out our unlimited plan. You will get unlimited access to 150 plus ASWB and NBCC approved continuing education courses for one low annual fee. We're always adding new courses. Did I mention we also have 5 free CE credits available too? Check it out at agentsofchangetraining.com.